Romeo was a shining beacon of my past life, my humanity. He was everything I'd ever wanted to have restored to me. I hadn't even realized what I'd missed out on until he'd run that mower over Robert's coffin and come into the house smelling alive. I stood looking down at the grass, which was now covered with a layer of dew that had solidified to frost overnight. By morning, the sun would melt the ice, but by Thanksgiving, a few weeks from now, we'd see snow in these woods. Robert would be buried by one more layer, but that would eventually melt away in the spring, too. The grass would come back, but whether I'd be alive to see it remained a mystery. There was a very good chance Robert's bones would stay where they were for an eternity. If the Conclave of Eight decided that I was to die the true death for killing Sergio's progeny, he'd no doubt end up with Robert's books, and the bones would continue to be entombed in this very spot forever. I squatted and reached down, plucking a tiny daisy with yellow petals out of some small greenery. I'd seen these flowering plants all over California, but I'd never seen the small yellow blooms for sale in any stores anywhere. I lifted the flower to my nostrils and inhaled, knowing what I'd find. Absolutely no scent at all. I squeezed the stem and turned the flower over, staring at the white sap that congealed on the end of the hollow stem. I smiled slightly, touching the sap, remembering how Romeo had wrinkled his nose when I'd asked what the daisies were called. "They're not daisies, they're weeds called dandelions. They're nothing but a nuisance, Vincent. Most gardeners spend their Saturdays ripping them out of their garden, though I hear some people eat their leaves. I never have. I always associate them with dog poo." I smiled, remembering how I'd laughed at that. Why dog poo? He turned to me and smirked. "Because they're just as annoying on someone's lawn as dog poo." What do you say, Robert? Do you like my choice? Or do you think Romeo is too human? Back in the present, I stared down at the ground, knowing I'd get no answer from my sire. I knew the answer already. If Robert could reply, he'd tell me Romeo looked like food and suggest which veins he'd prefer dining from. Then he'd slap me, perhaps do worse, and curse my desire to hold on to my humanity. He'd always loathed it, forced me to do things to make me forget it. Robert had beaten me, starved me, denied me blood so long I'd wasted away almost to bones, and then turned me loose on the innocent, watching me drain entire villages of men, women, and children to satisfy my thirst and his evil. He'd laughed as I'd bathed in the blood of innocence. It was the way vampires were, he had always told me. His methods had worked. For a time, I'd become what I'd always feared, a creature of the night with no soul, no heart, and no decency, driven only by bloodlust. I'd become evil personified, a child's death, a mother's nightmare, a father's terror. If we were going to survive what was coming when the Conclave of Eight came to Prosper Woods, I had to become that kind of vampire again. I dropped the flower and stood, turning on my heel and crushing it beneath my boot as I fled into the forest at vampire speed.